When we think of Hinduism and when we meet Hindus in the West, we often think of these words: tolerance, nonviolence, yoga, and mantras. Of course, these are all part of Indian and Hindu traditions. We also think of Hinduism as one of the world's great religions, up there with Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. But Hinduism wasn't always a religion as we understand the term today. In fact, it was really only under British colonial rule that the broader assembly of Indian and Hindu traditions started to begin to be seen as one. And in practice, it started to actually become more like a religion. Now, how and why did this happen? Well, this is a major theme we're going to explore today. How Hinduism not only became more of a religion, but also how it came to be seen in a way as the anchor of India's nationhood. Along the way, we're going to examine the crucial impact of European Christian missionaries upon Hinduism. Then we'll look at the Hindu reform movements, all of which sought to modernize Hinduism and in a way make it more like an Abrahamic religion in terms of practice, identity, and authenticity. And lastly, we're going to examine how some Hindu reformists fashioned a Hinduism that was synonymous completely with Indian nationhood and national identity. The larger lesson from today's lecture is for us to understand how greatly the broader traditions of Hinduism were affected by the colonial experience, which had profound repercussions for Indian Muslims and the eventual nationalist movement. Now, let's start with an overview of the impact of colonialism and specifically European Christian missionaries. Now, the impact of European modernity upon Hinduism through British colonial rule was massive. The British Raj, as we know, enacted major changes and transformations which greatly affected Hinduism. Brahmins and high caste Hindus were forced to reevaluate their traditions in the face of the humiliation of foreign colonial rule, like never before. Even under the Mughals, Hinduism had been relatively unaffected by Muslims ruling India. The Mughals never intruded into the daily lives and customs of Hindus as much as the British later would. And a lot of this starts with the Christian missionary impact. Missionaries, we know, were allowed into company territories after 1813, and their impact was immediately felt. Now remember, this was the 19th century. What do you think evangelical missionaries said about Hinduism and its beliefs and rituals? Well, Christian evangelical missionaries unleashed a chorus of contempt upon the so-called idolatry and paganism of Hinduism. Missionaries, for example, lashed out against caste discrimination, the use of idols. They were Protestant after all. The traditions of sati, child marriage, not allowing widows to remarry, among many other things. Many missionaries even said that Brahmins, with their privileged status and monopoly of a sacred language, Sanskrit, were not only similar to popish Catholic clergy, but were the incarnation of the devil himself. Caste was another factor which missionaries exploited. Protestant missionaries were particularly eager to go to India to convert people. Some of them had grand designs for the conversion of all of India to Christendom. They thought they could pull a Constantine, so to speak, with an Indian ruler, and then the rest of the country would follow. But when it became clear that rulers and Brahmins were very unlikely to convert, missionaries started to change focus and move towards lower castes and untouchables. And when famine, poverty struck, particularly when some of these low-caste children became orphans, missionaries swooped them up, housed them, and in a way forced them to convert. Such children were disparagingly called rice Christians, which basically presumed they converted only to gain a meal. Either way, missionaries, we know, did exploit the Indian caste system. So as we can see, this wasn't exactly like more 21st century feel-good exercises and interfaith dialogue held in Rome every year. Now, all of this greatly affected Hindus and high castes in a number of ways. For high caste Brahmins, never before had Hinduism's traditions been assaulted with such intensity. Remember, even Muslim rulers in the Mughals never critiqued Hinduism as much as European missionaries. But evangelical Christianity unleashed a theological assault upon Brahmins, Hinduism, and many of India's religious traditions. Now, how do you suppose many high caste Hindus saw this? Did they simply stand by and take it all in stride? Well, some did, and some of them ignored missionaries. But many others responded, and they largely responded in two different ways. The first was a more accommodative movement, and this is seen particularly in the works of Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. Let's start first with Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna, who lived from 1836 to 1886, was one of India's most saintly religious leaders. He was very much a universal moralist and, in a way, an Enlightenment-type deist. The son of a Bengali Brahmin priest in a small village, he was not very well educated. He only spoke Bengali and not English. So he was not part of this colonial milieu of exchange and debate between India and Europe. But Ramakrishna held to a traditionally Hindu and Indian notion of God, that God was manifest in people throughout human history, be they greater prophets such as Muhammad, Jesus, the Buddha, and Krishna, or simple common people. They all represented, Ramakrishna argued, divine light and manifestation. Ramakrishna's reforms drew upon the simplicity of Indian tradition and a more popular or country Hinduism. But he became very influential, particularly among the urban Bengali intelligentsia, the ones who had benefited the most from this colonial connection and were able to learn English and Western knowledge. Ramakrishna was popular in the West. His morals were inclusive and ecumenical. But this did not mean he was a devotee of the West. He quickly scuttled the missionary claim to an exclusiveness of truth and challenged the Western notion of rationalism. He saw missionary claims to exclusive truth and material progress, as seen in British industrialization, democracy, and eventual European power, as unfounded. Like other Indians, Ramakrishna noted the actions of the British and the Europeans were anything but Christian. Specifically, he actually ridiculed the Christian notion of the fall of man and the story of Adam and Eve and the need for redemption. To Ramakrishna, humans were inherently good, not evil, and this should be celebrated and cultivated. Ramakrishna later founded the Ramakrishna Mission, a global society dedicated to advancing peaceful coexistence and a more theistic-based morality. You can even see his followers parading the streets of London outside of Piccadilly Circus on the weekends. One of Ramakrishna's greatest disciples was Swami Vivekananda, who lived from 1863 to 1902. Vivekananda was a Bengali who continued the reforming work of Ramakrishna. But Vivekananda changed his outlook. He became more socially inclusive, taking in low castes. And unlike Ramakrishna, he actually received an English education and was fluent in the language of his colonial masters. Vivekananda became a famous and renowned spiritual leader, or Swami, and he took Ramakrishna's ideas even further, making selfless social service, or seva, as essential for all people. For Vivekananda, society's morality determined the strength of the future Indian nation. Only a moral society could rule itself and be a legitimate nation. Vivekananda was also accommodative of all religions, especially Islam. He stood strongly against religious fanaticism, in which he included Christian missionary preaching in India. His modernity of religion drew upon largely both Indian and Western ideals. Vivekananda believed that India could learn much in the ways of practical knowledge from the West. This was no doubt. But he also believed that the West had more to gain from India's moral and spiritual traditions located in Hinduism. In fact, at one point he argued that Britain had become not powerful because of Christianity, but in spite of it. And Vivekananda went global with his message. He went to America and attended the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, where he made a huge impact. He received a 2-minute standing ovation. Never before had Americans, and the West for that matter, been so directly exposed to Indian traditions found in Hinduism. He made it clear that, contrary to what missionaries claimed, India was self-sufficient in spiritual and religious knowledge. He argued that all faiths were equally valid, and that fanaticism and coercion in religion was a curse which had plagued the West and, he argued, more generally the Abrahamic faiths. He recited a hymn that he had learned at a younger age that went along like this: "As the different streams having their sources in different places all mingle their water in the sea, so, O Lord, the different paths which men take through different tendencies, various though they appear, crooked or straight, all lead to Thee." And he toured America too. Vivekananda spent 4 years on a speaking tour and founded societies in New York City and San Francisco. When he returned to India in 1897, he took a number of Americans back with him to India as his own disciples. What's really interesting is that Ramakrishna and Vivekananda both borrowed elements of religious modernity that had come with Protestant missions to India. They both borrowed methods the missionary societies had used: organization techniques, publicizing efforts, and general concepts of missionary work and service. Let's now move to the second, more confrontational, reformist movement in Hinduism, and it's called the Arya Samaj. The Arya Samaj, or the Society of Aryans, was founded in 1875 by Swami Dayananda. He argued that the Aryan peoples who brought Sanskrit to North India and who greatly influenced Indian and Hindu tradition throughout the subcontinent had founded originally a pristine, pure, golden age of society and worship, but it had become corrupted through the ages. Dayananda preached a purified Hinduism, free from what he considered the corrupting influences of caste restrictions, overblown ritual, idolatry, and polytheism. His constant mantra was "back to the Vedas," which he believed contained all the sources of knowledge, and as he argued, even allusions to the electricity and trains invented by Europeans. What he aimed to do was to revitalize and reform Hinduism back to what it was before. He sounded a lot like an original Protestant Christian in Europe in the 16th century. Like the missionaries he critiqued, Dayananda was obsessed with numbers and conversions. He saw how, according to the Indian census of 1871, many low castes and untouchables had converted to Christianity, and he saw this as a threat. And because he argued that all original Indians held to a pure, pristine form of worship, this meant something crucial for Indian Muslims. Most Indian Muslims who were of low caste background had effectively fallen by the wayside, and they therefore should be reconverted. So Dayananda and the Arya Samaj went around India seeking to reconvert Muslims and Indian Christians. They argued that according to blood, Indian Christians and Muslims were really Hindus. Their genetics and location in India could never be changed, he argued, by an outside Abrahamic creed. To Dayananda and the Arya Samaj, soil and territory equaled authenticity. India's land, he argued, was sacred, which meant its culture and traditions were equally so, and that they were native to India. This was important because it implied that Islam and Christianity, which had made major inroads into India through the centuries, were not native to India. Their religions were therefore seen as alien to India. Now, the Samaj wanted to reform caste, the usual critique of Christian missionaries. But Dayananda saw it as a virtue, in fact. The fourfold Varna organization of society, he argued, was virtuous. But the institution of jati, or birth, that had corrupted this over centuries. He argued that the Varna caste system was natural, for it engendered discipline and cohesion and stability in society. Dayananda's view was also historically based. He argued that India had a golden age known as the Vedic age between 2000 and roughly 500 BC. He claimed that in this era, Hindus were the very first in the world to receive knowledge of the formless God, or Nirguna, that the Abrahamic faiths professed. But to Dayananda, they received the purest form of worship. So you can see he was adopting a largely Abrahamic template to understanding religion. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were all historical religions, and now Hinduism was one too. This was seen in the publication of a treatise called The Light of Truth, or Satyat Prakash. Published in 1875, it openly ridiculed Islam and Christianity. Dayananda claimed the former was merely a misogynistic cover for Arab men to do what they wanted, while the latter was not disciplined enough to have prevented Europeans from falling into shallow materialism. Central to Dayananda's thinking was the concept of Sanatana Dharma, or timeless duty. He argued that since Hinduism was in complete sync with the universe, nature, and the cosmos, themselves God's creation, then Hinduism itself was an eternal religious and ethical system. It had no beginning and it had no end. This was a direct refutation to the Abrahamic idea of divine revelation in the Torah, the Gospels, and the Quran. To Dayananda, this was nonsense. If God's message and goodness were so magnificent, how could humans keep getting it wrong over centuries and keep fighting over it? The Arya Samaj also caused controversy in its caste campaigns. They adopted radical social ideas and sought to forcibly reconvert Muslims and Christians through a process called shuddhi, or repurification. The kicker was that Hinduism really has no concept of either conversion or apostasy. But Dayananda and the Arya Samaj just made them up. They took on an increasingly aggressive and proselytizing stance, which was a real novel innovation for Hinduism. And here, you can see it was clear that they borrowed the techniques of conversion and identity from Islam, and especially missionary Christianity. But let's think about it. How did Orthodox Brahmins react to readmitting low castes and untouchables into the fold? Well, many of them abhorred it. They were upset. To them, repurifying low castes would taint the whole edifice of caste hierarchy. The Shuddhi campaigns also upset Punjabi Muslims and led to sometimes communal conflict. In 1897, part of the Punjab nearly turned to a Hindu-Muslim civil war. An Arya Samaj leader, Lekh Ram, was assassinated. And though the case was inconclusive, many Hindus suspected a Muslim man, Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, who had predicted Ram's death, was involved. Later, in the 1920s, an Urdu pamphlet called Rangila Rasul, or the Playboy Prophet, mocked the Prophet Muhammad for having multiple wives. It was compared to Hindu spiritual leaders who remained celibate later in their lives. And it was explosive. Some of this was made possible, as we can see, by the structures of the colonial state. The first Indian census in 1871 was constantly referred to by the Arya Samaj. To them, it showed that Hinduism's numbers were declining relative to Indian Christians and Muslims. This showed that Hindus should be worried about missionaries' success in converting low-caste Hindu orphans after famines in particular. Now, the Arya Samaj was the most influential and enduring Hindu reform movement. It kind of represented a reconstitution of Hinduism, and in a way, it looked more like a Protestant religion. It boiled Hinduism down to a creed and streamlined practice, with the primacy of the Sanskrit Vedas and the monotheistic, socially inclusive Hinduism, which repudiated caste discrimination. It's clear that the Arya Samaj was directly responding to the impact of Christian missionaries in India. Now, let's move to look at how some Hindu reform movements came to color some Indians' understanding of their nation through a revitalized Hinduism. High castes responded to all of this activity, missionary and Arya Samaj alike. Brahmins were aware that they had a great civilization and tradition, and they didn't just keel over and accept this. They responded by selectively appropriating some ideas and critiques and refashioning others. Not only to throw them back in European faces, but also to construct ideas that would create an understanding that India was inherently a Hindu nation. There were two types of reactions by high castes to this flurry of religious activity and reformism. The first was a more orthodox reaction. Some Orthodox Brahmins argued that India was self-sufficient in its religion and traditions. These reformists were very different from the Arya Samaj, Ramakrishna, and Swami Vivekananda. These Orthodox Brahmins tended to defend the status quo and rarely offered alternatives. One example was the Bharat Dharma Mahamandala, or the Great Indian Society of Dharma. It was the most successful orthodox movement. It was founded by Pandit Din Dayalu Sharma in 1887. Like the Arya Samaj, Sharma believed that disunity had bedeviled Hindus. For him, unity was needed to preserve the Sanatana Dharma, or the eternal duty that had defined India. But what sort of Hindu unity did Orthodox Hindus want? One they defined as orthodox and traditional. Nothing that shook things up too much, especially in terms of caste. The Bharat Dharma Mahamandala was utterly against the Arya Samaj and their Shuddhi campaigns to bring low castes back into the fold. To these orthodox defenders, changing religious identity was a superficial exercise, for their caste never left them. One member of this group actually claimed that Christianity and reformist Arya Samajism only really, quote, allowed one to drink and eat leftover food. These Brahmins were concerned with protecting Hinduism's traditional rituals and preserving the ritual aspects of Orthodox Hinduism against both the charges of the Arya Samaj and Christian missionaries. These Brahmins saw the Arya Samaj as tainted by Western influence, and they were successful mostly in the pilgrimage cities of India, Haridwar, Benares, and Allahabad. And their patrons wouldn't have surprised anyone. The traditional leaders of India, such as zamindars, princesses, and maharajas, were the big supporters of this group. But a second type of reaction by high castes had a direct impact upon what would be called Hindu nationalism. And it also had an effect on how some high castes envisioned the Indian nation as being defined exclusively by Hinduism and nothing else. There's a contemporary dynamic in all of this. The Prime Minister of India in 2016, Narendra Modi, comes from a party called the Bharatiya Janata Party. And this party is cut from a similar cloth of the very Hindu nationalists that started to gain prominence in the 1880s, and who we are going to examine right now. Hindu nationalism got started with something called the Hindusabha movement in the 1880s. It was led by extremist nationalists who wanted to kick the British out right away, at any cost. This included Bal Gangadhar Tilak, active in the 1880s and 90s, and Aurobindo Ghosh, who was active in the early 1900s. The Hindu Sabha, or Hindu Society, was founded by Arya Samajists in the Punjab, where their message of Hinduness and nationhood was most receptive. The Sabha was formed to serve the interests of Hindus and to serve as a check against who they considered moderate Indian nationalists, who they felt were giving away far too much to Indian Muslims. To the Sabha, Muslims used to rule India. It was an historical argument, but now demographics mattered more. So to them, Muslims no longer had a claim to power beyond their numbers, which at the very most was no more than 15% of all of India. The Hindu Sabha saw the problems of universal nationhood. In shades of contemporary European debates, these Hindu nationalists argued that universal nationhood, based on shared values and citizenship, was a ploy. The ideas of universal nationhood, as espoused in the British, French, and American political cultures, to them were weak. These Hindu nationalists were far more sympathetic with German ideas of nations, that nations were constituted by ethnic and cultural belonging. They started something called the Hindu Sangathan movement. This literally means Hindu organization or unity, and its aim was to protect Hindus and fashion an idea of Indian nationhood, which was premised upon two factors. One was the demonizing of non-Hindus, mainly Muslims. They argued that Indian Muslims had external loyalties, which meant their spiritual loyalties were in far-off Mecca and Medina, not India. But at the same time, they had more cohesion and discipline than Hindus. Hindu nationalists firmly believed that Muslims were willing to die for their faith, and that their faith transcended various geographic, cultural, and linguistic divides. Of course, this was all greatly exaggerated. The second factor was the emergence of anti-Brahmin movements in Western India that were led by low-caste and untouchable Hindu groups. These anti-Brahmin movements wanted to eliminate caste completely. They publicly advocated rescinding Brahmins' social privileges and dominance of English language schools and clerkships. This forced high caste Hindu nationalists to try to reform caste, which they saw as stable. But it was also clear that high caste Brahmins went into a reactionary mode, seeking to defend their status and India's honor, of which they were the ordained defenders. Now, the Arya Samaj and Dayananda, the radical nationalist Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and others argued for a more forceful Hindu cohesion. This later influenced the emergence of the spiritual theoretician of Hindu nationalism, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, who lived from 1883 to 1966, was born into an elite Brahmin family from Western India. Savarkar was English educated and became a barrister trained in London. So he fit the Macaulay ideal of the loyal anglicized Indian gentleman. Savarkar published a book called The Indian War of Independence in 1909. This was his analysis of the Great Uprising of 1857. He argued that the uprising was not patchy and incoherent, which we know it was. He argued that, in fact, it was a war of national liberation from British rule. So he wasn't the best historian. And in 1928, Savarkar published the book Hindutva, Who is a Hindu? This was a radical treatise. In it, Savarkar argued that the Aryans who settled North India in the Vedic era were already a nation. They had an existing cohesion that was lost, and it needed to be reawakened in order for the Hindus to hold their own against Muslims and their now Christian masters. Now, the term Hindutva was really significant. It translates roughly as Hinduness, and what it implied was crucial. In his book, Savarkar argued that India was inherently a Hindu nation, or a Hindu Rashtra, and he offered 3 reasons as to why this was true. One was geographic unity. India, he argued, had a natural geographic cohesion and unity, which stretched from the Himalaya mountains and the western Indus River to the Bay of Bengal, surrounded by the oceans. This geographic cohesion was meant to generate a national cohesion and natural, divine-sanctioned organization. It was the opposite of the Austrian Empire in Central Europe, which moved over mountains, across rivers, and had no natural boundaries. For India, the lands between the Indus, the seas, and the Himalayas were natural and sacred, the innate borders of India. The irony is that when he got his wish in 1947 for independence, most of Pakistan ended up being carved out of the west of the Indus River. The second reason was racial commonality. Now, even though Savarkar believed that the Aryan impact was crucial in India's and Hinduism's emergence, he claimed that Hindus were all bound up by a mixing of blood via intermarriage. Aryans, he argued, intermarried piecemeal with the native inhabitants who were there before them. The whole point of jati and varna, caste norms, was to regulate and temper this, not to enforce discrimination. Thus, Savarkar argued, all Hindus had a shared blood pool. This was not, though, racial purity as seen in the German Nazi paradigm, but more of a shared common blood pool which couldn't be overcome by conversion to any outside religion like Islam or Christianity. The third reason was a common culture. Savarkar saw Hinduism not as a strict set of rules and doctrines as seen in the theologies of Christianity and Islam, but more as a culture that was adaptive and accommodative of regional differences. He argued that all the cultures of India, Bengali, Punjabi, Tamil, and even tribal ones, were all part of a broader Indian and Hindu culture. Now, given the time period and what Savarkar was arguing, which European writers and intellectuals do you think influenced him? You got it. Darwin, Huxley, Herbert Spencer, and even Adolf Hitler. In closely reading Savarkar, we can easily detect some influence of European fascist thinking and contemporary racial science. Like the fascists, Savarkar rejected the notion that the nation is made up of a social contract between individuals who choose a form of political authority, like in England, France, and the US, and government. He argued that society is an organic whole which constitutes the nation and which needs cohesion, discipline, and uniformity. But unlike European racial theorists, Savarkar rejected the notion of an authentic racial purity that either needed to be maintained or recaptured. This, as we know, had murderously disastrous effects in Eastern Europe during World War II. Yet this was significant, for Savarkar offered an alternative to moderate Indian nationalists who claimed to speak for all of India. Savarkar posed a major challenge to nationalists such as Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, who wanted to be as inclusive as possible, even of all of India's Muslims and Christians. But Savarkar's work wouldn't allow for this. The Hindus as a group were the ones who spoke for India, he said. Okay, let's stop for a moment to recap. We've looked at the impact of European Christian missionaries upon Hinduism. We saw how Hindu reform movements sought to modernize Hinduism and make it more authentic. And lastly, we examined how some Hindu reformists linked Indian nationhood with Hinduism to the implicit exclusion of other non-Hindu religious communities. So it's in this context that we should see the reconstitution of Hinduism under British colonial rule. The forces that the various traditions of Hinduism were subjected to, missionaries and technological changes under the Raj, all had the net effect of making Hinduism a more cohesive and religious tradition, like the Abrahamic faiths. It borrowed heavily from the techniques of missionary societies and responded to their criticisms in kind. And some reactions were lodged in ideas of nationhood, arguing that religion and nationhood were intertwined, and that in India was inherently a Hindu nation. This would pose problems later for the Indian National Congress Party, the All India Muslim League, and for various religious minorities in India after freedom was won in 1947.